There is a strange pattern in the way history is usually told. It focuses on beginnings, the rise of civilizations, the arrival of knowledge, the appearance of something new, but rarely does it pause to examine endings. Especially not the kind of ending that leaves no clear trace behind. Because what if the most important moment in human history was not when the gods arrived, but when they left? Ancient records, carved into stone and pressed into clay, do not only speak of presence. They speak quietly and almost reluctantly of absence. Not as a gradual fading, but as something more sudden, more final. A shift that feels less like evolution and more like a silence that arrived all at once. Imagine a world that had grown accustomed to guidance, a world where knowledge, structure, and perhaps even purpose seemed to come from something beyond itself. And then, without clear explanation, that connection is gone. Not replaced, not explained, just gone. What would that moment feel like? It would not be loud. It would not announce itself with a single event. Instead, it would feel like something missing that no one could fully describe. Like a conversation that stopped mid-sentence, leaving only the echo of what used to be understood. Some of the earliest civilizations seem to carry this feeling within their records. Not in obvious statements, but in subtle shifts. In the way certain descriptions simply stop. In the way certain presences are no longer mentioned. In the way attention turns inward, as if something external is no longer there to observe or respond. This is where the question begins to form. It's not about who the gods were or what they did, but about what changed when they were no longer here. Because absence has a different kind of weight than presence. Presence can be interpreted, explained, even dismissed. But absence, especially an unexplained one, tends to linger. It creates space for questions that cannot be easily answered. And perhaps that is why this moment is so rarely discussed, because it does not offer clarity. It does not provide a clean narrative. It leaves too much open. Yet, if these records are taken even partially seriously, then something happened. Something that early civilizations felt strongly enough to preserve, even if they could not fully understand it themselves. And that raises a quiet but persistent thought. You see, if there truly was a moment when something greater stepped away, then everything that followed may not just be the story of human progress. It may also be the story of what happens after being left alone. If this idea of absence feels difficult to place, it becomes even more uncertain when we consider the records themselves, because they exist in a form that is both simple and strangely precise. Clay tablets, shaped by hand, marked with symbols that have survived thousands of years. At first glance, they appear primitive, but the deeper one looks, the more unusual they become. These are not scattered myths told without structure. Many of them follow consistent patterns. Names repeat. Events align across different tablets. Sequences of actions are described with a level of detail that feels deliberate rather than symbolic. And within these descriptions, there are moments that seem to point towards something ending. Not fading into legend, but stopping. Some tablets speak of beings who came from beyond the earth. Others describe their roles, their interactions, even their conflicts. But what stands out is not only what is described, but what is no longer described after a certain point. References that appear consistently and then suddenly do not. It creates a strange tension, because if these texts were purely symbolic, one might expect them to evolve over time, to grow in complexity or shift in meaning. But instead, there are instances where the narrative simply cuts away from certain elements, as though something has been removed rather than transformed. This raises an uncomfortable question. Thus, why would a civilization preserve detailed accounts of presence, only to leave behind fragments that suggest disappearance without explanation? One possibility is that these stories were never meant to be taken literally, that they represent internal ideas, human attempts to understand forces of nature or consciousness. In this view, the departure could be symbolic, reflecting a shift in awareness rather than a physical event. But there is another possibility, one that feels harder to define. What if these records are not entirely symbolic? What if they are attempts to document something that was experienced but not fully understood? Something real enough to be recorded but unfamiliar enough that it could only be described through the language available at the time. In that case, the precision becomes more significant, as the repetition of names, the consistency of certain roles, the sudden absence of references. These would not be storytelling choices. They would be traces. And traces have a different kind of meaning. They suggest that something existed beyond the record itself, something that left an impression strong enough to be written down, even if the full context was never captured. But then another layer of uncertainty appears. Because if these are traces, they are incomplete ones. Pieces of a larger picture that is no longer visible. And without that full picture, interpretation becomes unstable. Every detail can be understood in multiple ways, none of them fully satisfying. So the tablets remain. Quiet, persistent, and unresolved. Not clearly myth, not clearly history. Just present enough to raise a question that does not easily settle. If the records are fragments of something real, then the silence they suggest is not just an abstract idea. It becomes something that had to be experienced, not by a single individual, but by entire communities. Generations who lived through a shift they may not have had the language to fully explain. It is one thing to imagine a world without guidance. It is another to imagine a world that once had it, and then didn't. Early societies may not have understood what had changed, but they would have felt it. In the rhythms of daily life, in the absence of certain expectations, in the quiet realization that something once relied upon was no longer there. Not suddenly enough to cause panic, perhaps, but clearly enough to create uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of shaping behavior. Rituals may have become more frequent, not less. Your attempts to reconnect, to restore something that had been lost. Offerings, ceremonies, repeated actions performed with increasing intensity, as if consistency alone could bring back what had disappeared. But over time, something else begins to happen. When a response is not received, interpretation begins to shift. What was once direct may become symbolic. What was once understood may become tradition without explanation. Actions continue, but their original purpose becomes less clear. This is how transformation begins, not through sudden change, but through gradual reinterpretation. At the same time, power structures may start to shift. In the absence of a higher authority, human figures begin to take on greater roles. Leaders, rulers, intermediaries who claim to understand or represent what is no longer directly present. Yes, but this creates another layer of tension. Because if the original source of guidance is gone, then any human attempt to replace it carries uncertainty. Authority becomes less absolute. It depends on belief rather than direct connection. And belief, unlike presence, can be questioned. This could explain why early civilizations often show signs of both confidence and instability. Systems are established, laws are created, structures are built. But beneath them, there is a sense that something is incomplete. as if these systems are attempts to fill a space that was never meant to be filled by human hands alone. There is also the possibility of fear. Not constant, overwhelming fear, but something quieter. The idea that what left might return, or that it left for a reason that was not fully understood. Yet this kind of uncertainty does not disappear easily. It lingers, shaping decisions in subtle ways, influencing how societies grow, how they organize, and how they remember. Because being left behind is not just an event, it is a condition. And if early humanity found itself in that condition, then everything that followed may have been influenced by a single, unspoken question. Not just what was lost, but whether it was meant to be. Over time, something quieter than absence begins to take shape. Not a sudden collapse, not a visible loss, but a gradual softening of what was once clear. Memory does not disappear all at once. It shifts, it blurs. It becomes something less precise, less certain, until eventually it feels more like a story than a recollection. If there was ever a moment when knowledge felt direct, it would not have stayed that way for long. Without reinforcement, even the most important ideas begin to change. Details fade first, then meanings begin to shift. What once had a specific purpose starts to take on broader interpretations, shaped by those trying to preserve it without fully understanding it. This is where forgetting begins. Not as a failure, but as a process, a natural consequence of time, distance, and uncertainty. But there is something unusual about the way this process appears in early civilizations, because what remains is not random. It is structured, but incomplete. Certain ideas persist with remarkable consistency. References to origins, to beings beyond human understanding, to moments of connection. But alongside these, there are gaps, missing explanation, sudden transitions where something important seems to have been left out. It creates a strange kind of narrative, one that feels intentional but fragmented, as if the pieces were preserved, but the full picture was never carried forward. This raises a possibility that is difficult to ignore. What if the forgetting was not entirely accidental? Not in the sense of deliberate removal, but in the sense that some knowledge may not have been meant to remain fully intact. That what was left behind was always going to change as it passed from one generation to the next. That the original meaning depended on a context that no longer existed. Without that context, interpretation becomes necessary. And interpretation introduces variation. Each generation reshapes what it receives, adding its own understanding, its own assumptions. Over time, the original form becomes harder to recognize. This is how knowledge transforms into mythology. Not through invention, but through adaptation. Through the quiet adjustments made by those trying to hold onto something they can no longer fully grasp. And yet even within these transformations, traces remain. Patterns that repeat across different cultures. Similar themes appearing in places that had no direct connection. It suggests that while details may change, something deeper continues to move through time. But deeper does not mean clearer. In fact, it often means the opposite. The closer something gets to its origin, the less directly it can be described. It becomes something that can only be approached indirectly, through symbols, through stories, through fragments that hint at something larger. So the process continues. Not just forgetting, but reshaping. Not just losing, but transforming. And somewhere within that process, the original knowledge remains. Not gone, but no longer fully visible. If something was lost, then it becomes difficult to avoid a deeper question. Not just what disappeared, but what existed before that disappearance, because understanding the absence requires at least some attempt to understand the presence that came before it. The earliest records do not present a single clear role for these beings. Instead, they describe actions that can be interpreted in different ways, depending on how closely one chooses to follow the details. In some passages, they appear as builders, figures associated with the creation of cities, the shaping of land, the establishment of order. Structures rise, systems form, and a knowledge seems to emerge in ways that feel guided rather than discovered. But in other moments, the tone shifts. The same beings are described less as creators and more as observers, watching, measuring, interacting without always intervening. Their presence feels less direct, more distant, as though they are studying something rather than shaping it. This contrast creates an unusual tension, because building and observing are not the same act. One involves intention, control, and outcome. The other suggests distance, curiosity, and perhaps even uncertainty. If both roles appear within the same set of records, then it becomes unclear which one defines their true purpose. One possibility is that these roles changed over time, that what began as active involvement slowly shifted into observation, in perhaps as certain processes were set into motion. Another possibility is that different groups existed, each with their own function, their own level of engagement. But there is also a third possibility, that the distinction itself may not be as clear as it seems, that what appears to be building could also be a form of observation, that shaping an environment might be a way of studying how that environment responds. In this sense, creation and observation become part of the same process, not separate actions but different aspects of a single intention. This idea introduces a quieter, more complex perspective. What if the presence described in these records was not solely about helping or controlling humanity, but about understanding it? Not as a finished creation, but as something evolving, something unpredictable. In that case, their actions would not always appear consistent, because they would not be driven by a single fixed goal. Instead, they would reflect a process, one that adjusts, responds, and perhaps even experiments. And if that were true, then the departure becomes even more difficult to interpret. Because leaving a completed task is one thing, but stepping away from something still in progress suggests a different kind of decision. It suggests that whatever was happening here may not have reached a clear conclusion. If their role was not clearly defined, then the question begins to shift inward, not just toward what they were doing, but toward what they may have been doing to humanity itself. Because scattered across different traditions, there are suggestions that humans were not simply observed or guided, but altered in some way. Now, if these suggestions are not always direct, they appear in fragments, stories of beings shaping humans from existing materials or combining elements to create something new. In some cases, the language feels symbolic, describing formation through metaphor. But in others, the descriptions become more specific, hinting at processes that feel less like imagination and more like interpretation of something witnessed. This is where the idea becomes difficult to settle. On one side, it can be understood as a reflection of early human attempts to explain their own origins, a way of giving structure to something that could not be fully understood. In this view, the involvement of external beings represents a projection of meaning onto a natural process. But on the other side, there is a different possibility, that these stories are not purely symbolic, but distorted accounts of interaction, that what is described as creation might actually be modification, not the origin of humanity, but an alteration of what already existed. If that were the case, then humanity would not be entirely separate from whatever came before, nor entirely independent of whatever influenced it. It would exist somewhere in between, a result of both natural development and external intervention. This idea carries a certain weight, because it challenges the sense of continuity that most histories rely on. It introduces the possibility that human development did not follow a smooth, uninterrupted path, but was shaped at certain points by forces that are no longer visible. There are also patterns that seem to echo this idea. Sudden advancements in early civilizations, skills appearing with little evidence of gradual development. Knowledge emerging in forms that feel too structured to have evolved slowly, yet too incomplete to have been fully understood. These patterns do not confirm anything on their own, but they do create a space where the question remains open. And within that space, interpretation becomes more complex, because if humanity was influenced in ways that are no longer fully remembered, then the records we rely on are not just incomplete. They are reflections of an already altered perspective. Stories told by those who inherited the result, not those who witnessed the process. This means that every explanation carries a layer of uncertainty. Whether one sees these accounts as symbolic or literal, they point towards something that is not entirely clear, and perhaps that lack of clarity is part of the story itself. Because if humanity was shaped in ways it no longer fully understands, then the question is not only about where we came from, but about how much of that origin still remains within us, waiting to be recognized. If their presence carried purpose, and their actions suggest some form of involvement, then the question becomes unavoidable. Why would they leave at all? Not gradually, not symbolically, but in a way that feels like a clear separation. Because departure, especially after sustained presence, implies a decision. And decisions are usually tied to reasons, even if those reasons are no longer visible. One possibility is that their purpose was completed, that whatever they came to do reached a point where further involvement was no longer necessary. In this view, departure is not abandonment, but closure, a transition from direct influence to indirect consequence. Humanity continues, but without further guidance, as if the next phase required independence. But this explanation introduces its own uncertainty. Because if the process was complete, why do the records feel unfinished? Why do they contain so many gaps, so many unresolved elements, as though something ended before it could fully settle into understanding? Completion usually leaves clarity behind. Yet what remains here feels partial, fragmented, almost interrupted. Another possibility is less structured. That departure was not planned, at least not entirely. That something changed, forcing a withdrawal rather than allowing a conclusion. This could take many forms: environmental shifts, internal conflict, or pressures that are no longer recorded. In some interpretations, there are hints of disagreement. Accounts that describe tension between different groups, conflicting intentions, or actions that do not fully align. If these hints are taken seriously, then departure may not have been a unified decision. It may have been the result of division. This introduces a different kind of uncertainty. Because if those who were present did not fully agree, then their influence would not have been consistent. Their actions would reflect multiple perspectives, not a single plan. And if that is the case, then the moment of departure may have been shaped by those same divisions. There is also a quieter possibility, one that does not rely on conflict or completion, but on distance, that their presence was never meant to be permanent, that whatever brought them here was temporary by nature, and departure was always part of the process, even if the timing feels abrupt from a human perspective. But even this leaves something unresolved, because temporary presence still leaves behind impact, and impact usually carries intention. If they knew they would leave, then the question shifts again. Not why they left, but what they expected to happen after they did. Did they anticipate the fragmentation that followed? The reinterpretation, the uncertainty, the slow transformation of knowledge into myth? Or was that an unintended outcome, something that unfolded beyond their control once they were no longer present? Each possibility opens a different path, but none of them fully close the question. And perhaps that is what makes the departure itself more significant than any single explanation. Because it remains a moment defined not by what is known, but by everything that still isn't. If departure was a decision, then the way it happened becomes just as important as the reason behind it. Because not all departures carry the same feeling. Some unfold slowly, with preparation and transition. Others leave behind traces that suggest something less controlled, something closer to urgency. Within the fragments that remain, there are moments that feel slightly out of place. Not dramatic in an obvious sense, but uneven. Sequences that seem to shift too quickly. References that appear and then vanish without explanation. Patterns that break in ways that are difficult to interpret as intentional storytelling. It is not what is said directly, but how it changes. In some accounts, descriptions move from structured interactions to brief mentions, as though the focus has been pulled away. In others, events seem compressed, as if details were lost or never fully recorded. There are instances where continuity feels interrupted, where the expected progression is replaced by sudden transitions. These are small details, easy to overlook. But when viewed together, they begin to form a subtle pattern, one that does not confirm urgency, but suggests it as a possibility. Because urgency rarely announces itself clearly in historical records. It appears indirectly through inconsistencies, through gaps, through the absence of expected explanations. If something changed rapidly, then those experiencing it may not have had the time or ability to document it fully. Their records would reflect confusion, partial understanding, and attempts to capture events that were moving faster than they could interpret. This perspective shifts the tone of departure. Instead of a clean ending, it becomes something more uncertain, a withdrawal that may have been influenced by factors not fully understood by those observing it, something that did not unfold according to a clear plan, but responded to conditions that are now difficult to reconstruct. There are also suggestions, though subtle, of tension within these moments. Not necessarily conflict in the way it is often imagined, but imbalance. Actions that do not align perfectly. Decisions that feel reactive rather than deliberate. If multiple groups were involved, as some interpretations suggest, then urgency could emerge from disagreement as much as from external pressure. A situation where alignment breaks down and departure becomes the only remaining option. But even without conflict, urgency can arise from change. A shift in environment, in conditions, in factors that made continued presence less stable or less necessary. Something that altered the balance enough to make staying no longer viable. Yet, despite these possibilities, there is no clear record of the cause. Only the effects remain, scattered across incomplete narratives. And this is where the uncertainty deepens, because urgency, if it existed, was not fully preserved. It left behind hints, not explanations, impressions, not clarity, which leads to a quieter realization. If the departure carried urgency, Then whatever caused it may not have been resolved. It may simply have moved beyond the reach of those who remained. If departure carried uncertainty, then what remains afterward becomes even more important. Not just the absence itself, but anything that might have been left in its place. Because in many transitions, especially those that are not fully explained, there are traces of guidance. Fragments that suggest preparation, even if that preparation was incomplete. Across early civilizations, there is a recurring pattern of structured systems appearing shortly after the period associated with divine presence. Laws, rituals, methods of organization, even early forms of measurement and timekeeping. These systems do not appear randomly. They follow logic. They show consistency. This raises a quiet question, as were these systems developed independently, or were they inherited in some form? One interpretation is that they represent human adaptation. That after a period of reliance, societies began to organize themselves using observation and trial. Over time, these structures became more refined, eventually forming the foundations of culture and governance. But there is another perspective, that these systems were not entirely created from scratch, but shaped by something that came before. Not given in complete form, but introduced in fragments. Principles rather than full instructions. Enough to guide, but not enough to remove uncertainty. This would explain why many early systems feel both advanced and incomplete at the same time. They show understanding, but also limitation. They provide structure, but leave room for interpretation. It is as if humanity was given a framework, but not the full context needed to fully understand it. This creates a unique dynamic, because when instructions are incomplete, they rely on interpretation, and interpretation introduces variation. Different groups may understand the same principle in different ways, leading to divergence over time. What begins as a shared foundation gradually separates into distinct paths. This may be why early civilizations, while showing similarities, also develop unique identities. Each one carrying fragments of a larger system, but reshaped through local understanding and experience. There is also the possibility that some instructions were preserved more carefully than others. Certain practices repeated with precision, even when their original purpose was no longer clear. And rituals that continue across generations, not because they are fully understood, but because they are believed to be important. But belief, like memory, can change. Over time, the meaning behind these practices may shift. What was once practical becomes symbolic. What was once direct becomes ceremonial. The structure remains, but its connection to the original intent becomes less certain. And yet, the persistence of these systems suggests something else. That even in the absence of full understanding, there was a sense that these fragments mattered, that they were worth preserving, even if their origin was unclear. Which leads to a subtle but important thought. If something was left behind, it may not have been meant to provide answers. It may have been meant to keep the questions alive. If these fragments were carried forward and reshaped but not entirely lost, then it becomes difficult to ignore how often similar patterns appear across different parts of the world. Civilizations separated by distance, language, and time seem to preserve echoes of something that feels strangely familiar. Not identical, but aligned in ways that are hard to dismiss as coincidence. In the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, there are accounts of powerful beings who came from beyond, shaping early human life before eventually stepping away. In the early narratives found within biblical traditions, there are references to divine figures interacting directly with humanity, guiding, correcting, and then becoming less visible over time. In Vedic texts, there are descriptions of higher beings whose presence once influenced the world more directly, before retreating into realms that are no longer easily accessed. The names are different, the language shifts, the symbolism adapts to culture and environment. But beneath those differences, there is a consistent structure. A period of presence, followed by a period of distance. Interaction, followed by separation. This pattern raises a quiet but persistent thought. What if these are not entirely separate stories? It is possible, of course, that each civilization developed its own explanations independently. That human minds, facing similar questions about origin and purpose, arrived at similar conclusions. This would explain the repetition without requiring any direct connection between them. But there is another possibility. That these stories are reflections of a shared memory, filtered through different perspectives, and that what appears as multiple narratives may actually be variations of a single event, interpreted through the lens of different cultures. If that were the case, then the differences become just as important as the similarities, because they show how each civilization understood and adapted what it received. The core idea remains, but the details shift, shaped by local beliefs, environments, and experiences. This creates a layered kind of history, one that does not move in a straight line but spreads outward, branching into multiple versions of the same underlying concept. And within those branches, certain elements remain consistent. The idea of beings who were once present, the sense that they played a role in shaping early human experience, and the recurring suggestion that, at some point, they stepped away. What makes this pattern difficult to ignore is not its clarity, but its persistence. It appears in places that had no direct communication. It survives across long periods of time. It adapts, but does not disappear. And that persistence suggests something deeper than coincidence. Not necessarily proof of a single origin, but an indication that something significant was remembered, even if imperfectly. Which leads to a more complex question. If multiple civilizations are carrying versions of the same story, then what exactly are they remembering? And perhaps more importantly, what part of that memory has been preserved, and what part has already been lost? As these patterns continue across different traditions, one detail begins to stand out more clearly. The origin of these beings is almost never described as coming from the earth itself, and instead there is a consistent association with the sky, not just as a symbolic space, but as a place of arrival and departure. In many accounts, these figures are described as descending from above, interacting with the world for a time, and then ascending once again. The language varies, sometimes poetic, sometimes direct, but the direction remains the same. They come from beyond, they remain for a period, and then they leave in a way that places distance between themselves and the earth. This recurring movement creates a subtle sense of separation, because the sky, in nearly every culture, represents something unreachable, something that exists beyond normal experience. When beings are associated with that space, they are immediately placed outside the ordinary boundaries of human life. Their presence becomes something temporary by definition, because their origin is not tied to the same conditions. But what makes this detail more interesting is how consistently it appears. From early Mesopotamian descriptions to later mythologies in distant regions, the idea of sky beings returning to where they came from continues to repeat. Sometimes it is described as a journey back to the heavens. In other cases, it is framed as a withdrawal into a realm that is no longer accessible. Regardless of the wording, the underlying idea remains stable. They do not simply disappear, they go somewhere. And that distinction matters, because disappearance suggests an ending without direction. But departure toward a specific place implies continuity. It suggests that wherever they went, they continued to exist beyond the reach of those left behind. This introduces a different kind of possibility, that the separation between humanity and these beings was not absolute, but spatial, a matter of distance rather than absence. They are no longer here, but they are not necessarily gone. This idea appears in subtle ways across different cultures. In some traditions, there are references to watching from above. In others, there are suggestions that the connection still exists, but in a form that is no longer direct. Not visible, not accessible in the same way, but not entirely severed either. At the same time, these accounts do not fully agree on the nature of that separation. Some present it as a natural boundary, something that cannot be crossed. Others hint at the possibility of return, sought either by them or by humanity, reaching upward in some way. This lack of agreement keeps the idea open, because if the sky represents more than just a physical space, then the meaning of departure becomes more complex. It is not only about where they went, but about what that direction represents: distance, limitation, or perhaps a threshold that has yet to be understood. And within that uncertainty, the pattern continues to hold. They came from above. They remained for a time. And then, without fully explaining why, they went back. As these patterns of departure continue to appear, another recurring element begins to surface alongside them. Not quietly, but with a kind of weight that is difficult to ignore. Across multiple civilizations, there are accounts of a great disruption, a moment when the world itself changed in a way that could not be easily reversed. Flood narratives are among the most widespread of these accounts. They appear in regions separated by vast distances, described in different languages, shaped by different environments, yet carrying a structure that feels deeply familiar. A warning, sometimes unclear. A destruction that affects nearly everything. And a survival that seems selective, as though something was meant to continue while something else was meant to end. At first, these stories can be understood as reflections of natural events. Flooding is not uncommon in many early civilizations, especially those built near rivers. Over time, repeated experiences could have shaped collective memory into something more dramatic, something that preserved the emotional impact even as details shifted. But the consistency of these accounts introduces another possibility. That what is being remembered is not a series of unrelated events, but a single moment that was experienced in different ways across different regions. A moment significant enough to leave an impression that endured, even as the specifics became less clear. This is where the connection to departure begins to form. Because in several traditions, the flood is not only described as destruction, but as transition. A boundary between what existed before and what followed after. A reset in the sense that the world that emerges afterward is not quite the same as the one that came before it. If this idea is taken seriously, then the timing becomes important. Could the departure of these beings be connected to such a transition? Not necessarily as a direct cause, but as part of the same sequence. A moment where multiple changes occurred at once, each influencing the other in ways that are no longer fully visible. In some interpretations, there are hints that certain individuals were prepared in advance, given knowledge or instruction that allowed them to survive. This suggests awareness not only of the event itself, but of its impact. And if awareness existed, then the question becomes more complex. Was the flood something that was anticipated? Something that required withdrawal before it occurred? Or was it the result of conditions that made continued presence impossible? These possibilities do not provide clear answers. Instead, they deepen the sense of connection between disappearance and disruption. Because if the world itself underwent a form of reset, and then the absence that followed may not have been separate from that process, it may have been part of it. And if that is the case, then what humanity inherited afterward was not simply a continuation of the past, but a version of it that had already been changed. If the world that followed was already altered, then the way its history is remembered would not remain fully intact. It would carry interruptions, breaks in continuity that are not always obvious, but become visible when examined closely. Across early historical records, there are moments where timelines feel uneven. Long stretches of development appear compressed into short periods, while other intervals seem extended without clear explanation. Events that should connect smoothly instead feel separated, as though something in between is missing. Yes, this does not always appear as a complete absence. More often, it appears as distortion, sequences that feel slightly misaligned, as if the order has shifted or certain parts have been rearranged over time. At first, these inconsistencies can be explained through natural causes. Records were not always preserved carefully. Oral traditions can change with each generation. Translation introduces variation, especially when symbols are interpreted differently across cultures. But even when these factors are considered, some gaps remain difficult to account for. There are instances where advancements seem to emerge without a clear developmental path. Knowledge appears in structured forms, yet the steps leading to that structure are not fully documented. It is as if something was understood at one point, but the process of arriving at that understanding was not carried forward. This creates a timeline that feels incomplete, not because nothing happened, but because not everything was preserved. If a significant disruption occurred, whether environmental or otherwise, then the continuity of knowledge would have been affected. Records could have been lost. Context could have disappeared. What remained would be fragments, preserved without their full connection to what came before. Over time, those fragments would be reorganized, placed into new narratives that attempt to create coherence from incomplete information. This is where the idea of a lost timeline begins to take shape. Not a timeline that never existed, but one that can no longer be fully reconstructed. A sequence of events that once formed a continuous story, but now exists only in pieces, scattered across different records and traditions. And within those pieces, there are hints of something more, moments that suggest greater complexity than what is commonly accepted. References that point to knowledge that does not fit neatly into the surrounding context. Details that seem to belong to a larger structure that is no longer visible. These hints do not provide a clear alternative history. They do not form a complete narrative on their own, but they do create a sense that what we have is not the full picture. And if the timeline itself is incomplete, then interpretation becomes uncertain. Because without knowing what has been lost, it becomes difficult to understand what remains, which leads to a quieter realization. What appears as the beginning of recorded history may not be the beginning at all, but simply the point where the fragments start to reappear. As these fragments continue to surface, the line between memory and myth begins to blur in a way that is difficult to separate. What was once experienced may no longer exist in its original form, but it does not disappear completely. Instead, it transforms. It becomes something that can be carried forward even if it is no longer fully understood. This transformation does not happen all at once. It unfolds slowly, shaped by repetition, interpretation, and the limits of human memory. Over generations, details begin to soften. Specific events become broader narratives. Precise descriptions shift into symbolic language. What was once direct becomes layered with meaning that was not originally there. This is how memory adapts when it cannot remain exact. It changes form in order to survive. In early civilizations, this process is visible in the way stories are told. There is often a mixture of structured detail and abstract imagery, as though two different modes of understanding are being combined. One part attempts to preserve what happened. The other part tries to make sense of it in a way that can be communicated. This creates narratives that feel both grounded and distant at the same time. Familiar enough to recognize as human experience, yet unusual enough to suggest something beyond ordinary events. From one perspective, this can be seen as the natural development of mythology. Humans using imagination and symbolism to explain the unknown. Over time, these explanations become stories, and those stories become part of cultural identity. But from another perspective, the process looks different. Instead of invention, it becomes translation, not from one language to another, but from one level of understanding to another. What could not be fully expressed directly is reshaped into forms that can be remembered, even if they are no longer precise. If this is the case, then mythology is not separate from memory. It is what memory becomes when it passes beyond its original context. This idea introduces a different kind of uncertainty. Because if myth carries fragments of memory, then dismissing it entirely may mean overlooking something that was once real. At the same time, taking it literally without context can lead to interpretations that miss the underlying meaning. This creates a tension that is difficult to resolve. Each story exists in a space between fact and interpretation, shaped by both what was experienced and how it was remembered. And as time continues to pass, that balance shifts further, making it harder to trace the origin of any single idea. Yet, despite this uncertainty, certain patterns persist. Themes that repeat across cultures. Structures that remain recognizable even when details change. These patterns suggest that something continues to move through time, even as its form evolves. But whether that movement represents preserved memory or constructed meaning is not something that can be fully determined. And perhaps it was never meant to be. If the presence that once shaped early civilizations truly faded, then what followed would not simply be a continuation, it would be a shift. Not necessarily immediate or dramatic, but noticeable in the way human behavior begins to change. Before this point, many accounts suggest a kind of reliance. Structures, knowledge, even direction appear connected to something beyond human authority. But once that connection weakens or disappears, something else begins to emerge. Human independence. At first, this independence may not have been intentional. It could have begun as a necessity. Without direct guidance, decisions that were once external now had to be made internally. Choices that once relied on instruction now depended on interpretation. This transition would not have been smooth. Because independence, especially when it follows dependence, carries uncertainty. Without a clear reference, every decision becomes an experiment. Every action carries the possibility of error. And without immediate correction, those errors become part of the system itself. Yet over time, something begins to stabilize. Human societies start to organize themselves more clearly. Roles become defined, Leadership structures emerge not as reflections of external authority, but as creations of human need. Order is no longer imposed from beyond, but constructed from within. This shift changes more than just governance. It changes perception. Instead of looking outward for direction, attention begins to turn inward. Observation replaces instruction. Experience becomes a source of knowledge. Patterns are recognized, tested, and repeated. Slowly, a different kind of understanding begins to form. But this understanding is not the same as what came before. It is more limited, but also more adaptable. It relies on human capability rather than external influence. It evolves through trial and error rather than direct transmission. And because of that, it carries a different kind of strength. At the same time, something is lost. Not necessarily knowledge in a measurable sense, but clarity. The sense that certain things were once known without question. That certain structures had a defined origin. Independence replaces certainty with possibility, but also with doubt. This creates a balance that is not entirely stable. Human societies grow, develop, and expand. But beneath that growth, there remains a subtle awareness that something is missing. Not always consciously, but present in the way systems are constantly adjusted, refined, and sometimes replaced. It is as if independence brings both freedom and responsibility, but also a quiet search for something that once existed, and that search does not always lead forward. Sometimes it circles back, returning to fragments of the past, trying to understand what they once meant and whether they still hold relevance in a world that has moved beyond their original context. As independence begins to take shape, it does not replace what came before without leaving something behind. Instead, it creates a space where absence is felt but not fully understood. And within that space, something begins to form that attempts to reconnect what has been lost. This is where the early foundations of religion begin to appear more clearly, not as a sudden invention, but as a gradual response. A way of maintaining a connection to something that is no longer directly present. Rituals that once may have been interactions become structured practices. Your communication that may have once been immediate becomes symbolic. What was once experienced becomes believed. This transition is subtle but significant, because belief operates differently than presence. It does not rely on direct confirmation. It exists in a space where interpretation plays a central role. And as interpretation expands, so does variation. Different groups begin to shape their understanding in different ways. The same underlying ideas take on new forms, influenced by environment, culture, and experience. Over time, these variations become distinct systems, each carrying its own structure, its own explanations, and its own methods of maintaining connection. Yet, beneath these differences, certain elements remain consistent. The idea of something greater, at the sense that humanity is not entirely separate from whatever existed before, and the belief that connection, even if indirect, is still possible. This consistency suggests that religion is not simply an invention, but a continuation, not of direct experience, but of its memory. A way of preserving what could not be fully understood, using the tools available at the time. But preservation does not guarantee accuracy. As religion develops, it becomes more structured. Rules are defined, roles are established, interpretations become formalized. What begins as an attempt to reconnect can gradually shift into a system that organizes belief rather than exploring it. This creates both stability and limitation. On one hand, structured belief provides continuity. It allows ideas to be carried forward across generations without being lost entirely. On the other hand, it can fix those ideas into specific forms, reducing the flexibility that once allowed them to adapt. Over time, this balance continues to shift. Some traditions maintain openness, allowing interpretation to evolve. Others become more rigid, focusing on preservation rather than exploration. But in both cases, the underlying purpose remains connected to something earlier. A response to absence. A way of filling the space left behind, not by replacing what was lost, but by creating a framework through which it can still be approached. And within that framework, the original questions remain. Not always spoken directly, but present in the structure itself. Questions about origin, connection, and the possibility that what once existed may not be entirely out of reach. As these belief systems begin to take shape, another shift happens alongside them. Knowledge, which may once have existed in a more unified form, starts to divide. Not in a sudden break, but through gradual separation. Ideas that may have once been connected begin to stand apart, forming distinct areas of understanding that no longer fully align with each other. This fragmentation does not appear as loss at first. In many ways, it looks like growth. Different groups focus on different aspects of knowledge. Some develop systems related to governance, others to observation of the natural world, others to ritual and meaning. Each path becomes more refined over time, gaining depth within its own boundaries. But as these paths deepen, they also move further away from one another. Connections that may have once existed between them become less visible. What was once understood as part of a larger whole begins to feel separate, even unrelated. The sense of unity that might have connected knowledge across different domains starts to fade. This creates a different kind of limitation. Because while individual systems become more advanced, the relationship between them becomes less clear. Knowledge is no longer experienced as a single structure, but as multiple structures existing side by side, each one complete in its own way, but not fully integrated with the others. Over time, this separation becomes more pronounced. Traditions develop independently. Interpretations evolve without direct reference to one another. Even when similar ideas appear, they are expressed differently, shaped by the specific context in which they exist. This process can be seen in the way early civilizations approach the same fundamental questions: origins, purpose, structure. Each culture develops its own answers, its own methods of explanation. And while these answers often share underlying patterns, they no longer connect as directly as they might have once done. This raises an important possibility: that what appears as diversity of knowledge may also reflect a deeper fragmentation. Not just different perspectives, but pieces of a larger understanding that has been divided over time. If that is the case, then the absence of a unifying framework becomes significant. Because without that framework, interpretation becomes localized. Each system explains itself within its own boundaries, without necessarily connecting to others. And as generations pass, those boundaries become more defined, making it harder to see the connections that may have once existed. Yet, despite this separation, certain patterns continue to repeat. Ideas that emerge independently but carry similarities that are difficult to ignore. Structures that align in subtle ways, even when developed in isolation. These patterns suggest that fragmentation is not complete, that even as knowledge divides, something continues to move beneath the surface, linking these separate paths in ways that are not always visible. But without a clear understanding of what was lost, it becomes difficult to know how these fragments once fit together. And so the process continues. Expansion on the surface, separation beneath it. As knowledge separates and systems begin to form independently, another shift emerges beneath the surface. It is less about ideas and more about control, because when a central source of authority disappears, something inevitably moves to take its place. In earlier structures, authority may have been tied to something beyond human reach. Whether interpreted as direct presence or symbolic guidance, it provided a reference point that stood above individual influence. But once that reference weakens or fades, the balance begins to change. Authority becomes human. At first, this transition may not have been intentional. It could have begun as a practical necessity. Decisions needed to be made, systems needed to function. Without a higher source to consult, individuals or groups step forward to fill that role. Not as replacements, but as intermediaries. Over time, these roles begin to solidify. Leaders emerge not only as organizers, but as figures who interpret meaning. They do not simply manage resources or maintain order. They define direction. They shape how knowledge is understood and how belief is expressed. This introduces a new dynamic, because when authority is human, it carries limitations. It depends on perspective, interpretation, and, at times, intention. Unlike an external reference that remains consistent, human authority can shift, adapt, and sometimes contradict itself. This creates both stability and instability at the same time. On one hand, centralized leadership allows societies to function more efficiently. Decisions can be made more quickly. Structures can be maintained with greater consistency. On the other hand, this concentration of authority introduces the possibility of imbalance. Different leaders may interpret the same ideas in different ways. Systems that begin with a shared foundation can diverge depending on who holds influence. Over time, these differences can become more pronounced, leading to variations in structure, belief, and governance. In some cases, authority becomes closely tied to the idea of connection with what came before. Certain individuals or groups claim a deeper understanding of earlier knowledge, positioning themselves as the link between humanity and what was lost. This adds another layer of complexity, because it blends power with interpretation. Authority is no longer only about organization, but about meaning, and meaning, unlike structure, is not easily measured. It can be shaped, adjusted, and sometimes reinforced in ways that are difficult to challenge. As societies continue to develop, these dynamics become more embedded. Systems of governance, religion, and knowledge begin to overlap, each influencing the other. Authority is reinforced through belief, and belief is structured through authority. Yet beneath this structure, the original absence remains. The space that allowed this shift to occur does not disappear. It simply becomes less visible, covered by the systems that formed in response to it. And within that hidden space, a quiet question continues to exist. Whether what replaced the original authority was ever meant to fully take its place, or whether it was always only a temporary solution to something deeper. As these systems of authority and belief settle into place, another element begins to move quietly beneath them. It does not always appear openly, but it shapes behavior in subtle ways. A sense that what once existed is not entirely gone, and that absence may not be permanent. This feeling does not take the form of constant fear. It is quieter than that, more like an awareness that remains in the background, influencing decisions without always being acknowledged directly. In many traditions, there are references to return. Not always clearly defined, not always immediate, but present enough to be remembered. Stories that suggest a time when those who left may come back, or moments when signs are interpreted as indicators of renewed presence. These ideas are rarely consistent. Some describe return as something expected, even welcomed. Others frame it as uncertain or even unsettling. But regardless of interpretation, the underlying concept remains. Departure was not necessarily final. This introduces a different kind of tension. Because if return is possible, then absence becomes temporary rather than absolute. It creates a condition where the present is not entirely independent, but exists in relation to something that may reappear. This possibility can shape behavior in subtle ways. Actions may be guided by the idea of being observed, even in the absence of direct presence. Systems of belief may include elements that prepare for eventual return, whether through preservation of knowledge, continuation of rituals, or adherence to certain structures. At the same time, there is uncertainty about what that return would mean. Would it restore what was lost? Would it change what has been built since? Or would it reveal that the path humanity has taken has moved too far from its original direction? These questions are not always answered directly. Instead, they remain within the structure of belief and narrative, influencing how societies interpret both past and future. In some cases, the idea of return becomes symbolic, a way of expressing hope for restoration or clarity. In others, it is treated more literally, as a possibility that exists beyond current understanding. But whether symbolic or literal, the effect is similar. It keeps the connection to the past active. It prevents complete separation. It maintains the idea that what once existed still holds relevance, even if it is no longer visible. And this creates a balance that is not entirely stable. On one side, humanity continues to develop independently, it's building systems and knowledge through its own efforts. On the other, there remains an awareness that this independence may not be the final state, that something else may still exist beyond it, something that has not been fully understood and may not yet be fully gone. And within that uncertainty, the present becomes something more than just a continuation of the past. It becomes a moment suspended between what was and what might still return. If the past carried fragments of something greater, then it becomes difficult to ignore how certain patterns continue to appear, even in the modern world. Not in obvious ways, not as direct repetitions, but as structures that feel strangely familiar when viewed from a wider perspective. At first, modern society seems entirely separate from ancient civilizations. Technology has advanced, systems have become more complex, and understanding appears to have moved far beyond early interpretations. But beneath that surface, there are underlying patterns that echo earlier forms. Systems of organization, for example, still follow hierarchical structures. Layers of authority, channels of decision-making, frameworks that guide behavior and maintain order. While the details have changed, the structure itself remains recognizable. This similarity raises a subtle question. Are these structures entirely new, or are they continuations of something older? One possibility is that they developed independently, shaped by practical necessity. Hierarchies can emerge naturally in any organized system, providing efficiency and clarity. From this perspective, the resemblance to earlier structures is simply a reflection of common human needs. But there is another way to look at it. That these patterns are not entirely new, but inherited in some form. Not through direct transmission, but through continuity of behavior. Ideas that were once introduced, even partially, continue to influence how systems evolve, even when their origin is no longer remembered. This would explain why certain forms persist across time, adapting to new conditions while maintaining a similar underlying structure. The details shift, but the framework remains. There are also parallels in the way knowledge is organized. Specialization, separation of disciplines, and structured learning systems all reflect patterns seen in earlier civilizations, though in more advanced forms. Again, this can be explained through natural development, but the repetition suggests something deeper, a continuity that is not always visible, but consistently present. Even in areas such as law and governance, there are echoes of earlier systems. Principles of order, balance, and accountability that appear in ancient codes continue to influence modern frameworks, though often in modified forms. This does not necessarily prove direct connection, but it suggests that certain ideas have persisted, carried forward across time, even as their context has changed. And if that is the case, then the line between past and present becomes less defined. What appears to be progress may also be continuation. What feels new may be an extension of something older, reshaped through different conditions. This introduces a quieter, more reflective thought. That humanity may not have moved entirely beyond what came before, but is still operating within patterns that were set long ago. Not consciously, not intentionally, but through structures that continue to guide behavior in ways that are not always recognized. And if those patterns remain, then the question begins to shift once again. Not just what has been inherited, but whether that inheritance is leading somewhere specific. If certain patterns continue across time, then the idea of progress begins to take on a slightly different shape. What is often seen as new may not be entirely new. It may be something rediscovered, reconstructed from fragments that were never fully lost, only transformed. Modern technology, for example, is usually understood as the result of steady advancement, a gradual accumulation of knowledge, refined through experimentation and observation. And in many ways, this explanation holds. Each development builds on what came before, creating a clear path of progression. But there are moments within that progression that feel less gradual, sudden leaps, where understanding seems to accelerate beyond what was expected. Discoveries that emerge not just from incremental change, but from insights that appear almost fully formed. These moments do not break the pattern of progress, but they do introduce questions about how knowledge unfolds. One way to interpret this is through human capability. The idea that the mind, given enough time and information, can reach points of understanding that feel sudden, but are actually the result of long preparation. Yet there is another possibility. That some of what is being developed now is not entirely original, but connected to ideas that existed in earlier forms, that not preserved directly, but carried forward in fragments, waiting to be recognized and reassembled. This perspective does not require complete continuity. It allows for loss, for fragmentation, for gaps in understanding. But it suggests that certain principles may persist beneath the surface, reappearing when conditions allow them to be understood again. In this sense, technology becomes more than invention. It becomes a process of uncovering, reaching toward something that was once known, even if that knowledge was incomplete or not fully preserved. There are parallels that seem to support this idea. Descriptions found in ancient records that resemble modern concepts, though often expressed through symbolic language. Tools and structures that appear advanced for their time, and yet are not fully integrated into the broader development of that period. These parallels do not provide direct evidence of continuity, but they create a space where the idea of rediscovery becomes possible. And within that space, the meaning of progress begins to shift. Instead of a straight line moving forward, it becomes something more layered, a movement that includes both advancement and return. Exploration that moves outward while also reaching back towards something that may have been partially forgotten. This does not diminish the achievements of the present. If anything, it adds depth to them. Because rediscovery requires recognition. It requires the ability to see patterns, to connect fragments, to understand something that is not immediately obvious. And if that process is taking place, even in subtle ways, then modern development may be part of a larger cycle. Not just creating something new, but gradually remembering what was once there. If progress can include elements of return, then the idea of history as a straight, forward-moving line begins to lose some of its certainty. Instead, another possibility starts to emerge. One where time does not simply move ahead, but moves in patterns. Cycles. This idea appears in different forms across various traditions, not always described in the same way, but carrying a similar structure. Periods of growth followed by decline. Moments of clarity followed by loss. Civilizations rising, reaching a peak, and then fading, only to be replaced by new ones that follow a similar path. At first, this can be understood as a natural process. Societies are influenced by resources, environment, and internal dynamics. Over time, these factors change, leading to shifts in stability and development. From this perspective, cycles are simply the result of repeating conditions. But there is another way to look at it, that these cycles are not entirely independent, but connected. That each phase carries traces of the one before it, even if those traces are not immediately visible. Knowledge is lost, but not completely. It remains in fragments, influencing what comes next. This creates a layered continuity. Instead of starting from nothing, each new phase begins with what remains from the previous one. Even if that remainder is incomplete, it shapes the direction of development. Over time, patterns begin to repeat, not because they are identical, but because they are built on similar foundations. This idea becomes more interesting when connected to earlier concepts. If there was a moment of disruption, such as a large-scale reset, then cycles could form around that event. A period before the disruption, followed by a period after, each influencing the next. Over long stretches of time, this pattern could repeat, creating a sequence of civilizations that rise and fall within a larger framework. In this context, history becomes less about isolated events and more about recurring phases. Each phase different in detail, but similar in structure. There are also hints of this idea in ancient narratives. References to ages or eras, each with its own characteristics, each eventually giving way to the next. These descriptions are often symbolic, but they suggest an awareness of repetition. Not exact repetition, but rhythm. And within that rhythm, the role of humanity becomes more complex. Instead of moving steadily toward a final point, it becomes part of an ongoing process. A cycle that includes development, loss and renewal. Progress and regression existing within the same movement. This perspective does not provide a clear end point. It does not suggest that everything repeats in the same way. But it does introduce the possibility that what is happening now may not be entirely new. That similar patterns may have occurred before, even if they are no longer fully remembered. And if that is the case, then the present moment becomes something more layered. Not just a continuation of the past, but a point within a cycle that may have unfolded many times before. If patterns repeat and cycles continue, then the idea of observation begins to return in a quieter, is more subtle way. Not as a clear presence, not as something directly experienced, but as a possibility that remains just beyond confirmation. Earlier accounts suggest that humanity may have once existed under some form of attention. Whether that attention was active or distant is unclear, but the sense of being observed appears in multiple traditions. And if those traditions hold even a fragment of truth, then the question naturally extends forward. Did that observation truly end, or did it simply change form? In the modern world, there is no direct evidence of external presence in the way ancient descriptions imply. Daily life continues without interruption, shaped by human systems and understanding. Yet there are moments where the idea of observation feels less distant than it should. Not through obvious signs, but through patterns that suggest awareness beyond immediate explanation. This does not point to anything specific. It does not confirm presence, but it introduces a possibility that remains difficult to fully dismiss. That observation, if it ever existed, may not require direct interaction to continue. It could exist at a distance. In earlier narratives, the shift from presence to absence often includes a transition upward, toward the sky or beyond. If that movement represents distance rather than disappearance, then observation could persist without being directly visible. This idea changes the nature of absence. Because absence no longer means separation. It becomes a difference in perspective. A condition where one side remains visible while the other moves beyond the range of perception. It is there are also ways in which modern development aligns with this possibility. As humanity creates its own systems of observation, technologies that monitor, record, and analyze, it begins to mirror something that may have existed before. Not intentionally, but through the natural progression of capability. This reflection introduces an unusual symmetry. Humanity, once potentially observed, now becomes the observer, watching itself, tracking patterns, seeking understanding through data and structure. And in doing so, it recreates a dynamic that feels strangely familiar. Whether this is coincidence or continuity is not clear. But it raises a question that does not easily settle. If observation was once part of human experience, then its absence may not be complete. It may exist in forms that are not immediately recognizable, operating beyond the limits of direct perception. At the same time, there is no definitive way to confirm this, which leaves the idea suspended between possibility and uncertainty. And within that space, the question remains open, not as a claim, but as a quiet consideration. That perhaps the story did not move from observation to isolation, but from visibility to distance in a way that has not yet been fully understood. If observation has shifted rather than ended, then another question begins to form beneath it. Not about what exists beyond human awareness, but about humanity itself, its current state, its direction, and whether it has reached a point that aligns with whatever came before. Readiness is not a simple concept. It does not refer only to knowledge or capability. It includes understanding, stability, and the ability to interpret what is encountered without distortion. And when viewed through that lens, the present moment becomes more difficult to define. On one hand, human development has reached levels that would have been difficult to imagine in earlier times. Systems of communication, exploration, and analysis have expanded far beyond basic survival. Knowledge is no longer limited to small groups, but distributed across vast networks. This suggests progress. But on the other hand, fragmentation still exists. Despite access to information, understanding is not always unified. different perspectives continue to divide interpretation. Systems that connect also create separation, shaping how knowledge is received and understood. This creates a condition where capability and clarity do not always align. Humanity can achieve complex outcomes, yet still struggle to agree on their meaning. It can explore beyond its immediate environment, yet remain uncertain about its own origin. It can build systems of immense scale, yet continue to question the foundations on which those systems are based. In this context, readiness becomes more complex than simple advancement. It is not only about what can be done, but about how what is done is understood. If there was ever a moment when external influence interacted with humanity, then the idea of readiness may have been part of that interaction. Not necessarily as a goal, but as a condition, a state in which certain levels of understanding would allow for different forms of connection. This raises a quiet possibility, that the absence experienced may not only be about departure, but about timing, and that what stepped away did so at a point where continued interaction was no longer aligned with the state of humanity at that time. If that is the case, then the present becomes part of a longer process. Not simply a continuation, but a phase that may lead toward something else. But that direction is not clearly defined, because readiness is not measured by a single factor. It is influenced by knowledge, but also by how that knowledge is used, by capability, but also by the intentions behind it. And without a clear reference, it becomes difficult to determine where humanity stands within that process, which leaves the question open, not as something that requires an immediate answer, but as something that continues to develop over time. Whether humanity is approaching a point of readiness, or whether it is still moving through stages that have yet to fully align with what once existed. For all that has been preserved, there is an equal presence of what has not. The tablets, the inscriptions, the narratives passed across generations. They offer fragments, glimpses, patterns that can be followed for a time. But they do not complete the picture. In many ways, they feel as though they stop just before something important is fully revealed. This absence is not always obvious. At first, the records appear detailed. Names are given, actions are described, sequences unfold in a way that suggests intention. But as those sequences are followed more closely, certain points emerge where the explanation narrows, then fades. Not into silence, but into something less defined. It is in these moments that the limits of the record become visible. Key transitions occur without full context. Decisions are implied but not explained. Events are referenced without a clear cause. It is as though something was understood at the time, but not carried forward in a way that could be fully preserved. This creates a kind of boundary, a line between what can be traced and what cannot. Everything on one side appears structured, even if incomplete. Everything beyond that line remains uncertain, not because it lacks importance, but because it lacks clarity. One explanation is that these gaps are the result of time, that records were lost, damaged, or never fully created. Over thousands of years, it is natural for information to disappear, leaving only what could be preserved under specific conditions. But there is another possibility, that what is missing was never meant to be fully recorded. Not because it was unimportant, but because it could not be expressed in a way that would remain stable across generations. Some knowledge may depend on context that does not survive translation, requiring direct experience rather than description. If that is the case, then the tablets represent more than incomplete history. They become markers, points that indicate where understanding once existed, even if that understanding cannot be fully recovered. This perspective changes how the records are viewed. Instead of asking only what they contain, attention shifts toward what they imply. Not just the information that remains, but the structure of what is missing. Patterns that suggest something larger, something that extends beyond the visible fragments. And within those patterns, there is a sense that the most important details may lie just outside the reach of what has been preserved. Not hidden in the sense of being concealed, but absent in a way that leaves space for interpretation. Which brings the narrative to a quieter realization. That the story, as it is currently understood, is not complete. And perhaps it was never meant to be fully contained within the records that remain. If the records are incomplete, then every attempt to understand them carries a certain level of uncertainty. Not because the information is meaningless, but because interpretation depends on perspective. And perspective, especially across long stretches of time, is never fixed. So the symbols used in ancient records do not translate directly into modern language. They represent ideas, not always in a literal sense, but through layers of meaning shaped by the culture that created them. When those symbols are viewed without that original context, they can shift. What once pointed to a specific understanding may now suggest something entirely different. This is where misinterpretation begins. Not as a mistake, but as a natural outcome of distance. Each generation approaches the same material with its own framework of understanding. It uses familiar concepts to explain unfamiliar ones. Over time, these explanations become accepted, even when they may only reflect part of the original meaning. This creates multiple versions of the same idea. Some interpretations focus on symbolic meaning, and seeing the records as expressions of human thought and imagination. Others lean toward literal explanations, viewing the descriptions as direct accounts of real events. Each perspective offers insight, but neither fully resolves the uncertainty. Because both are shaped by what is already known, and what is already known may not include the context required to fully understand what was originally intended. There is also the possibility that some interpretations move further away from the original meaning over time. As ideas are repeated and reinterpreted, they can accumulate layers that were not part of the initial record. These layers may add clarity in some areas, but they can also obscure the underlying structure. This process is difficult to avoid. It is part of how knowledge evolves. Yes, but it also means that certainty becomes harder to maintain. The more a record is interpreted, the further it can move from its original form, even as it becomes more detailed in explanation. This leads to a different kind of awareness. That understanding is not only about what is written, but about how it is read. The same text can produce different meanings depending on the perspective applied to it. And without a clear reference point, it becomes difficult to determine which interpretation comes closest to the original intent. This does not make the records unreliable, but it does place them in a space where meaning is not fixed, where each explanation remains open to revision, shaped by new insights and changing perspectives. And within that space, a quieter question begins to form. Not whether the records are true or false, but whether they are being understood in the way they were meant to be. A question that does not lead to a final answer, but continues to shift as understanding itself evolves. If interpretation continues to shift, then the story itself does not remain fixed in the past. It extends forward, shaped not only by what has already happened, but by how it is understood in the present. Each new perspective becomes part of the narrative, adding layers that were not there before. This creates a sense that the story is not complete. Not in the sense that something is missing, but in the sense that it is still unfolding. The past provides a foundation, but it does not define the entire structure. What exists now becomes part of the same sequence, connected through interpretation, memory, and the continuous search for meaning. In this way, humanity is not separate from the narrative. It participates in it. Every attempt to understand the past influences how the present is experienced, and every development in the present shapes how the past is interpreted. The relationship moves in both directions, creating a dynamic that is constantly evolving. This movement does not always follow a clear path. There are moments where understanding seems to advance, where connections become more visible, where patterns begin to align. But there are also moments where uncertainty deepens, where new information raises more questions than it answers. This balance between clarity and uncertainty keeps the narrative open. It prevents it from settling into a final form. If the earlier idea of cycles holds some truth, then the present may represent a point within a larger process, or not the beginning, not the end, but a phase where multiple layers of the story intersect. Past influences remain active, while future possibilities begin to take shape. This perspective changes the way time is experienced. Instead of moving in a straight line, it becomes something more fluid. Past, present, and future interact, each influencing the others. The story becomes less about sequence and more about connection. Within this framework, the idea of departure takes on a different meaning. It is no longer only an event that occurred at a specific moment. It becomes part of an ongoing relationship between presence and absence, knowledge and uncertainty, memory and interpretation. And if that relationship continues, then the possibility of change remains open. Not necessarily in the form of a return, but in the form of new understanding, insights that emerge not from new information alone, but from new ways of seeing what has always been there. This keeps the narrative in motion, always extending, always adapting. And within that movement, a quiet realization begins to settle. That the story being explored is not something distant or separate, but something that continues to unfold through the way it is being understood right now. As the story continues to unfold through interpretation and time, one idea remains consistently present, though never fully defined. The possibility of return. Not as a fixed event, not as something that can be predicted with certainty, but as a question that continues to exist beneath the surface of many traditions. It appears in different forms, sometimes as expectation, sometimes as warning, though sometimes as a quiet suggestion that what once was may not be permanently gone. These variations do not agree on the details, but they share a common structure, a sense that absence is not necessarily final. This idea introduces a unique kind of tension. Because if return is possible, then the present moment exists in relation to something beyond itself. It is not entirely separate from what came before, but part of a larger sequence that may not yet be complete. At the same time, the nature of that return remains uncertain. Would it resemble what is described in early records? Would it appear in a form that is recognizable, or in a way that is entirely different? These questions do not have clear answers, and perhaps they are not meant to. Because the concept of return is not only about what might happen, it is also about how the present is understood. If there is a possibility that something could reappear, then it influences how absence is perceived. It becomes less about loss and more about distance, less about ending and more about interruption. This perspective changes the tone of the narrative. Instead of moving toward closure, it remains open, The past is not sealed off, but connected to what may still unfold. This connection does not require constant attention, but it remains present as a possibility that shapes interpretation. There is also the question of recognition. If return were to occur, would it be understood in the same way it once was? Or has the passage of time altered perception to the point where the same presence would be interpreted differently? This adds another layer of uncertainty. That's because return is not only dependent on what returns, but on how it is received. The same event can carry different meanings depending on the perspective through which it is viewed. And perspective, as has been seen, is not fixed. It evolves, influenced by knowledge, belief, and experience. This means that the idea of return cannot be separated from the idea of change. Whatever may or may not occur would exist within a context that is different from what came before, and that context would shape how it is understood. So the question remains, not as something to be answered immediately, but as something that continues to exist alongside the narrative. Not demanding resolution, but inviting reflection, in whether return is a possibility that will unfold, or a concept that exists to keep the connection between past and present from fully closing. As the narrative reaches this point, it does not arrive at a conclusion in the way most stories are expected to. There is no final resolution, no single answer that gathers every idea into a clear and complete form. Instead, what remains is something quieter, a sense that the story has not ended, but simply moved beyond what can be fully traced. This absence of closure is not accidental. It reflects the nature of everything that has been explored. Fragments that never fully connect, patterns that repeat without fully explaining themselves, records that suggest more than they reveal. Each part contributes to a larger structure, but that structure remains partially hidden, yet extending beyond what can be clearly seen. In this way, the ending mirrors the beginning. The same sense of absence returns, but with a different weight. At first, it appeared as something unfamiliar, a gap that raised questions. Now it feels more like a boundary, not empty, but filled with possibilities that cannot be fully resolved. This shift changes how the silence is understood. It is no longer just the result of something leaving. It becomes part of the story itself, a space where meaning continues to exist, even without clear definition. Within that space, the ideas explored do not disappear. They remain active, moving quietly beneath the surface. Questions about origin, influence, and continuity continue to unfold, not as fixed problems to be solved, but as perspectives that can be revisited from different angles. Yet this creates a different kind of ending, one that does not close the narrative, but keeps it open. Because if the story is incomplete, then it allows for continuation. Not necessarily through new events, but through new understanding. Each time the fragments are examined, each time the patterns are reconsidered, the narrative shifts slightly, revealing something that may not have been noticed before. This movement does not require urgency. It does not demand answers. Instead, it invites observation, a quiet attention to what remains and to what might still be forming beyond the visible edges of the story. And perhaps that is where the deeper meaning begins to settle. Not in the certainty of what happened, but in the awareness that not everything can be fully known, that some aspects of the past exist beyond complete understanding, and that this uncertainty is not a limitation, but part of the experience itself. Because a story that cannot be fully closed continues to exist, not as a finished account, but as something that moves forward with time, shaped by those who engage with it. And within that movement, the silence that once felt empty begins to take on a different form. Not an absence of meaning, but a presence that has yet to be fully understood.